There comes a moment in every wounded soul's journey when silence becomes the loudest cry, and loneliness wraps around the heart like a second skin. You do not choose this moment, it chooses you. It arrives after betrayal, after abandonment, after the very ones you once prayed for walked away as if your presence was disposable. You sit in the wreckage of a bond that once felt eternal, now shattered into a silence that screams louder than any goodbye. And in that silence, you begin to wonder if love was ever real, if loyalty ever mattered, or if your heart was simply a canvas on which others painted their selfish desires. But this is the place, yes, this very place, where divine intervention begins. Not with thunder, not with a dramatic rescue, but with something quieter, something deeper. It begins with God removing the need from your soul. Not the memory, not the pain, but the need. Because when you've been hurt by the ones you needed most, the healing isn't just about mending the heart. It's about remaking it so thoroughly that you no longer seek your wholeness in the arms that once let you fall. You see, there is a sacred transition that happens in the hidden places of heartbreak. While you weep over those who hurt you, God begins the work of extraction. Not just extracting them from your life, but extracting the illusion that you ever needed them to become what He created you to be. And that's the real miracle, isn't it? Not that they left, not that you survived, but that you were never truly dependent on them to begin with. We only believe we need those who hurt us because we mistake comfort for connection, longevity for loyalty, and familiarity for faithfulness. We bind ourselves to memories instead of reality, to potential instead of patterns. But God, in His mercy, allows the pain to peel back the layers of deception so we can finally see truth, raw and unfiltered. And that truth says you were never meant to stay bound to those who use your kindness as currency and your love as leverage. Perhaps you begged God to fix it. Perhaps you cried into your pillow, pleading for restoration, asking Him to return what once was. But what if His silence was not a denial, but a deliverance? What if, in His divine wisdom, He knew that if He gave you what you asked for, you would only bleed longer, ache deeper, and delay the healing you deserve? So instead of answering with restoration, He answers with removal. And then He begins the holy process of detachment, not from the person, but from the illusion that they were ever your source. This is where the transformation begins, when the ache remains but the need disappears, when you still remember them but the desperation is gone, when you hear their name and feel nothing, not rage, not love, just release. And in that sacred emptiness, God fills you with something more stable than their presence ever was. His peace. Not a fleeting emotion, but a foundation. Not a temporary fix, but a holy redefinition of what you truly need. And He does more than just remove the need. He replaces it with revelation. The kind that shows you how much you were carrying that was never yours. The kind that reveals that you were the blessing all along, that your heart was the gift, that your love was the treasure, and they were too blind, too broken, or too selfish to recognize it. And instead of punishing you for giving too much, God rewards you by giving you the kind of strength that doesn't need applause, permission, or presence to be real. The people who hurt you may never apologize. They may never change. They may go on pretending as if they did no wrong. But God doesn't need their confession to begin your restoration. He doesn't wait for their guilt to validate your pain. He moves, not based on their regret, but on your surrender. And when you finally let go, not just of them, but of the idea that you needed them, He moves swiftly. He reorders, He replenishes, He restores. And the beauty of it is this: when God removes the need, He also removes their power. They can no longer control your emotions. They can no longer haunt your dreams. They can no longer dictate your worth, because worth, in the hands of God, is never subject to another person's failure to see it. So if you find yourself alone today, misunderstood, cast aside by those you once held close, take heart. This is not abandonment. This is alignment. It may feel like loss, but it is protection. You are being refined, not rejected. You are being pruned for purpose, not punished for love. And though it may ache now, the pain is a midwife to something holy. The day you no longer need those who hurt you. The day their absence feels like peace, not punishment. The day you wake up and realize you are free. Freedom does not always come dressed in joy. Sometimes it walks in wearing the cloak of heartbreak. It does not knock gently. It storms in when you are at your weakest, when your hands are trembling from holding on too long, and your heart is exhausted from carrying the weight of false hopes. But it is freedom nonetheless, the kind of freedom that breaks not chains, but illusions. The kind of freedom that doesn't roar but whispers, "You're going to be okay without them." There is something sacred about the moment you realize you survived what you thought would destroy you. When the fog begins to lift and you look around and realize that the world didn't end when they left, that the nights you feared would drown you in loneliness actually became the birthplace of deeper strength. That your prayers, though soaked in tears, were never ignored. They were interpreted differently by a God who sees the whole picture, not just the moment of loss. We often think that being strong means never breaking. But the truth is, strength is born in the breaking. It's in the moments when your heart is fractured and your faith is trembling that God begins to show you what was always true. Your value was never dependent on those who mishandled it. It was never diminished by their departure. You were whole before they came. You are still whole now that they're gone. Sometimes God lets them walk away not because they were bad people, but because their part in your story was complete. And holding on to someone whose season in your life has ended is like trying to plant flowers in winter. It will not bloom, no matter how much you water it. So God steps in. He closes the door you were too gentle to shut. He severs ties you were too afraid to cut, not to punish you, but to prepare you, because what's ahead requires your full heart, not one divided by the echoes of betrayal. And while it may feel cruel in the moment, it is mercy in disguise, because had He not removed them, you would still be waiting for them to change. You would still be shrinking to keep them comfortable. You would still be breaking yourself into pieces to keep them whole. But you were not made for that kind of bondage. You were made to rise, to be filled, to be chosen, not out of convenience, but from genuine love and respect. This is the holy unraveling, where God lets everything fall apart so you can finally see what was never built on Him. And as it all crumbles, He does not stand from a distance. He draws near, not with easy answers or instant relief, but with presence, with promises, with the slow, steady rebuilding of your spirit. He becomes the one who never leaves, never lies, never makes you feel like you are too much or not enough. And slowly, what once felt like devastation becomes revelation. You stop asking why they hurt you and start thanking God that He showed you the truth. Because there is a certain blindness that love brings. It makes you see people not as they are, but as you hope they'll become. It gives you the patience of saints, the tolerance of angels. But God, in His divine sight, sees the heart. He sees what's hidden behind kind words and familiar smiles. He sees intentions before they become actions. And when He intervenes, it is not because He wants you to suffer. It's because He loves you too much to let you remain where love is not real. And that's the part we often forget, that God's love is not just about giving. Sometimes it's about taking. He takes away the counterfeit to make room for the authentic. He removes what you were settling for to prepare you for what you were destined for. And in the process, He detoxes your heart from the poison of dependency. He teaches you how to breathe again without their validation, how to dream again without their presence, how to stand again without leaning on broken pillars. You begin to see the beauty in solitude, not loneliness, but solitude, the sacred space where God becomes your closest companion, where you hear His voice louder because theirs is finally gone, where your identity is no longer tied to what they thought of you, but to what He has declared over you. And in that space, healing begins, not as a single moment, but as a quiet revolution of the soul. You'll start noticing things, how your smile returns without effort, how your sleep deepens without tears, how your energy no longer drains at the mention of their name. These are not small things. They are signs, evidence of a divine restoration underway. God is not just healing you, He is reshaping you, teaching you that your peace does not come from people who left, but from the one who stays. You'll remember the times you begged for them to come back. You'll remember the prayers you whispered in desperation. And then you'll smile, not because you got what you asked for, but because you now have what you didn't know you needed. The strength to never ask again, the strength to walk away, the strength to trust that if they were necessary for your destiny, they would still be here. But they're not, and that's not your failure, that's God's protection. There will be days when memories try to return dressed as hope. Days when your mind replays the good moments louder than the betrayals. When nostalgia paints over the wounds with soft colors that hide the scars but not the truth. And in those moments, you'll be tempted to wonder if you overreacted, if maybe they didn't mean to hurt you, if perhaps there's still something worth saving. But do not mistake emotional echoes for divine instruction. Just because a memory knocks does not mean you must answer. Just because a chapter was beautiful does not mean it deserves a sequel. God knows the full story, not just the parts you romanticize, but the hidden pages soaked in silent pain, the nights you couldn't speak, the times you sacrificed your peace for their comfort, the moments you swallowed your tears to keep them from feeling guilty. He saw it all, and His decision to remove them was not impulsive. It was intentional, because He knows the future you're walking into, a future that does not require the presence of those who couldn't value you when you had nothing but love to give. And the longer you walk this path, the clearer it becomes. You begin to feel lighter, not because the pain disappeared, but because the burden of need was lifted. You no longer scan every room for familiar faces that once ignored you. You no longer shrink to fit into spaces where your voice was too loud or your dreams too big. You no longer define your worth by who stayed and who didn't, because you've come to understand that love is not proven by presence, it's proven by consistency. And those who left proved they were never rooted in your soil. They were just passing through like shadows at sunset, brief, fading, and never meant to last. There is a fierce kind of peace that comes when you no longer beg God to bring them back, but instead thank Him for taking them away. It's not bitter, it's not cruel, it's clarity. The kind of clarity that reveals how many times you were breaking yourself to keep something whole that was already falling apart. How many times you were extending grace to someone who was using it as a license to continue hurting you. How often you confused endurance with loyalty and tolerance with love. This is the wisdom God gives through pain. The ability to look back with gentleness, not guilt. To see the story not as a tragedy, but as training. To recognize that the heartbreak wasn't meant to destroy you, but to develop you. That the very people who made you feel small were the reason you now stand tall. That their rejection was a tool in God's hand to push you toward the version of yourself that no longer tolerates disrespect disguised as love. And that is something worth praising. Not just that you survived, but that you grew. That you are no longer the same. That the version of you who cried over them has evolved into someone who prays for them from a distance, but never opens the door again. Someone who can forgive, but not forget the lesson. Someone who loves themselves enough to walk away when love turns into manipulation, when connection becomes control, when presence feels like punishment. God doesn't just heal, He upgrades. He takes what broke you and turns it into the blueprint for a stronger, wiser, more discerning heart. He uses the betrayal not as a curse, but as a compass, pointing you away from those who diminish your worth and toward those who will honor it. And in doing so, He reclaims the narrative. No longer are you the one who is left, the one who is hurt, the one who is too much or never enough. You become the one who was preserved, the one who was protected, the one who was chosen. Not by people, but by purpose. And here is the quiet truth. You didn't need them to find yourself. You didn't need them to become whole. You didn't need them to reach your calling. What you needed was to be emptied of them so that God could fill you with Himself, with peace that isn't shaken by abandonment, with joy that doesn't depend on others' approval, with identity that isn't rooted in what they gave or took, but in what He promised and provided. They walked out and you were still standing. They turned away and you kept walking. They forgot you, but God remembered. And not only did He remember, He recorded every tear, every prayer, every moment of silent suffering. Not a single detail was wasted. Because with God, pain is never the end. It is the middle, the forging, the furnace. And what emerges from that fire is not a victim, but a vessel, one who no longer clings to what hurt them, one who no longer feels less because others saw less, one who knows now, deep in the marrow of their bones, that they will never need the ones who hurt them again. The ones who hurt you may have believed they held power over your future, that their absence would leave you stranded, empty, undone. They thought walking away would leave a void so deep that you would come crawling back, apologizing for loving too deeply or caring too much. But they underestimated the one who holds your soul. Because God does not abandon the broken-hearted. He does not sit idly while His children are dismissed by those who were never meant to carry their hearts. In time, the very silence that once terrified you becomes your sanctuary. The stillness that used to echo with loneliness now hums with strength. You no longer wait for the phone to ring. You no longer scan the past for signs you missed. You are not bitter. You are becoming someone who no longer depends on others to validate what God has already confirmed. Becoming someone who is not shaken by who stayed or who left, but anchored in a love that never wavers. There is something divine about discovering that you can walk into rooms they swore you could never enter, that you can breathe freely in spaces where they once took up all the air, that you can become everything they said you weren't, and more. Not out of spite, but out of surrender. Surrender to a process that hurts but heals, breaks but rebuilds. You learn that God never needed their presence to bless you. Now, neither do you. You stop measuring your value by how quickly they forgot you. You stop looking at their new connections as proof that you were replaceable. You realize that speed is not a sign of depth, that moving on quickly isn't healing, it's escaping. And those who hurt others without remorse always run, not because they are free, but because they are afraid of stillness. Stillness forces them to face the truth, that they lost something sacred, and no matter how far they go, their conscience follows. Meanwhile, God is not rushing. He is rebuilding you slowly, carefully, intentionally. He is turning your wounds into wisdom, your pain into power. He is writing a new story that no longer includes characters who mishandled your worth. And you, in your quiet strength, begin to rise, not with rage but with resolve, not with vengeance but with vision. You rise because the God who lifted you from the pit is now setting your feet on solid ground. And in this rising, you begin to understand something profound. The blessing was never in being needed. It was in being known, truly known, fully seen, deeply loved. And God in His mercy gives you that. He surrounds you with people who do not just tolerate your light but celebrate it. People who do not take from your spirit but pour into it. People who are not intimidated by your strength but inspired by it. You begin to laugh again, not to hide the pain, but because you're genuinely joyful. You begin to trust again, not because people are perfect, but because you've been made whole enough to discern who is real. You begin to hope again, not for the return of those who left, but for the arrival of what God always intended for you to have. And while they may never see the damage they caused, while they may never apologize or acknowledge their wrongs, you no longer need it, because you have outgrown the need for closure from those incapable of giving it. You have outgrown the need for justice in the form of regret. Your justice is your healing. Your power is your peace. Your victory is your ability to no longer need what once kept you bound. That is when you know God has done the work. Not just on the outside, but on the inside. Not just in your circumstances, but in your soul. When you can walk past what hurt you and not flinch. When you can hear their name and not ache. When you can look in the mirror and see someone who is no longer waiting for an apology, but living in abundance. And that abundance isn't loud. It doesn't need to be seen or posted. It radiates from within. It's in your calm, your clarity, your confidence. It's in the way you carry yourself, not as someone who is broken, but as someone who is built. Not by people, but by God. And no matter what they think, what they say, or what they do next, one truth remains unshaken: you will never need them again. Not because you never cared, but because you finally understand that needing those who hurt you is a chain disguised as longing. And God does not raise beggars of love. He raises sons and daughters who walk in worth, who carry themselves like royalty, who understand that rejection is often the first step to redirection, and that the pain of losing someone is often the price of finding yourself. There will come a day when you look back and hardly recognize the version of yourself that once clung so tightly to those who broke you. You'll remember the tears, yes, but not with sorrow. You'll remember the prayers, but now with gratitude, because every desperate cry, every sleepless night, every silent ache was leading you here, to a life where your worth is no longer negotiable, and your peace is no longer disturbed by people who never intended to stay. God does not simply remove what is harmful. He reveals why you were holding on in the first place. He digs deeper than the pain and exposes the void that made you believe you needed them at all. Was it fear of being alone? Was it the hunger for validation? Was it the hope that if you just loved harder, they would finally see your value? Whatever it was, God doesn't shame you for it. He heals it, and that healing redefines your relationship with need. You begin to understand that needing others is not wrong, but needing those who drain you, diminish you, and dishonor you is not love. It is a form of self-abandonment. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you feel the weight lifted, you cannot go back to carrying it. Once you taste the peace that comes from detachment, the chaos of old attachments no longer appeals to you. They may still talk, they may twist the story, they may try to make you the villain in a narrative they crafted to protect their ego. Let them, because you no longer live for their version of events, you live for the truth. And God was there. He saw what happened behind closed doors. He knows what you gave. He knows what it cost you. And while they rewrite history, He is writing your future. One that no longer includes the need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. This is where your strength multiplies, quietly, consistently, sacredly. You start choosing your peace over their presence. You start saying no without guilt. You stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening to begin with. You understand that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not to invite them back, but to release the hold they had on your heart. And you forgive, not because they deserve it, but because your soul deserves to be free. God sees that. He honors that. He steps into that moment and begins to expand you, not just in spirit, but in vision. He shows you what they were keeping you from, the dreams you put on hold, the voice you silenced, the calling you postponed to accommodate their comfort. He restores what was stolen in the silence, the belief in yourself, the joy in your own company, the sacredness of your standards, and slowly, without fanfare, you rise, not out of rebellion, but out of revelation. There's a holy clarity that emerges when God finishes what He starts. He not only removes your need for them, He also removes your regret. The what-ifs turn into thank God I saw it. The why me turns into look at me now. You begin to see yourself not as someone discarded, but as someone divinely redirected, someone chosen for something higher, something quieter, something so rooted in heaven's timing that no earthly rejection can ever undo it. And the beauty is, you don't have to force anything anymore. You don't chase. You don't beg. You don't over-explain. What is meant for you recognizes your worth without needing a presentation. What is meant for you honors you the first time. What is meant for you doesn't require the slow erosion of your self-worth to keep it alive. And what God intends for you will never require you to lose yourself. This is your resurrection, from dependency to dignity, from loss to liberation, from being needed to being known. You no longer ache for them to return because their absence no longer wounds you. It confirms your freedom. You no longer measure your worth by their ability to stay because your value is held in the hands of the one who never left. They were never your source. They were never your anchor. They were a lesson. And now that the lesson is learned, the cycle ends. The doors that once closed in your face are now irrelevant. You're no longer knocking. You're building. You're creating. You're walking paths they never saw because they were never meant to walk them with you. And that is not a tragedy. That is the mercy of God. He saw what you couldn't. He knew what you didn't. And in His love, He ensured you would never have to depend on those who once turned your love into a burden. He made a way where you couldn't even see the road. He broke attachments you couldn't bring yourself to sever. And now you are not just surviving, you are thriving in a life where you don't need them anymore. There is a quiet beauty in becoming someone who no longer waits for closure to move forward. You don't seek revenge, don't wish harm, don't replay conversations hoping they'll sound different. Instead, you live. You live with the kind of peace that can't be explained, only experienced. You wake up and your heart doesn't ache the same. You walk past old places and don't feel the weight you used to carry. The world didn't change. They did, and more importantly, so did you. God will always remove what stands between you and your healing. Sometimes that looks like isolation. Sometimes like unanswered prayers. Sometimes like heartbreak so deep it feels like a storm with no end. But in that storm, He anchors you. Not to the people who left, but to the purpose they could never carry. Because some people only walk with you when you're bleeding. They don't know what to do when you begin to heal. You were never too much. You were never too broken. You were never hard to love. You were simply loving people who didn't know how to receive the kind of heart that gives without conditions. And that is not your shame. It is your power. You loved fully. You stood with sincerity. You believed in people who didn't believe in you. And though they walked away, God remained. While they chose convenience, God chose you. And now He is setting the table, not with their apologies, but with new beginnings. Not with their return, but with your release. You don't need them to make peace with the past. You don't need them to admit their wrongs for you to rise. What you need, what you've always needed, was never in their hands, it was in God's. He is the one who breathes life into your dry bones. He is the one who turns your mourning into dancing. He is the one who shows you that what you thought was the end was simply a redirection. And in that redirection, you find the strength to walk alone, not because you have to, but because you finally can. You are no longer tethered to what hurt you. The ties have been cut. The need has been lifted. The silence they left behind has become a song of resilience. And you've learned to dance in it. You've learned to pray in it. You've learned to rest in the fact that God doesn't always give back what was lost, because sometimes what was lost was never meant to stay. You now walk with wisdom born of weeping, with discernment carved from disappointment, with faith that wasn't handed to you in comfort but forged in fire. You don't need their validation, because you've been validated by the one who knew your name before they ever misused it. You don't need their company, because you've been kept company by the God who sits beside the broken and whispers life back into their lungs. You are free now, free from the weight of needing what was never rooted in truth, free from the cycle of trying to earn a love that was conditional, free from the belief that your healing depends on the people who caused your wounds. You don't need their love. You don't need their understanding. You don't even need their acknowledgement. Because the greatest act of grace God ever gave you was not just healing, but detachment, a holy disconnection, a divine unbinding. And now you stand not as someone abandoned, but as someone redeemed. Not as someone forgotten, but as someone protected. Not as someone who was left behind, but as someone who was carried through. And when the memories try to return, you smile, not because they didn't matter, but because they no longer hold power. Not because you didn't love deeply, but because now you love wisely. Not because the past is erased, but because your future no longer needs its permission to unfold. So walk forward, with your head high, with your spirit steady, with your heart no longer searching for what walked away, because God has already decided. You will never need the ones who hurt you again.